seeking to garner today, and that is to get a journalist's perspective, to get journalists' perspective from different countries that are very, very engaged in the international discussions and related activities, to try to lend some new insights and new avenues of discussion among all of us in the policy community. And I'll introduce our panel in a minute. Certainly the question of Korea and of North Korea and its nuclear weapons isn't going away anytime soon, and clearly the North Korean program is accelerating more rapidly than almost any observer had anticipated. It poses tremendous difficulties not just for Northeast Asia but for the entire international community. These missiles of various ranges don't have to go in any one direction, they can go in any direction. And so this is a global problem, and in particular, in light of last Tuesday's missile test, this problem is still very, very germane and very, very high, I know, on the Trump administration and on the agenda of all of the governments that we'll talk about today. So rather than take a traditional approach to this, we wanted to offer a fresh take. We've convened a group of all journalists and one expert, although I consider all the journalists experts as well. No offense to the four of you. For the discussion today, they were convened and handpicked based on their extensive experience reporting on and analyzing this very, very important issue from the perspective of both policy and diplomacy. And I think they can offer something pretty unique and quite valuable, a keen sense of how different audiences around the world, different publics, ordinary citizens, how do they feel about what's going on in North Korea and about various countries' reactions to what's going on. And so we hope to answer such questions from their country's perspective, such as how big a threat is North Korea, really, now and going into the future? Who is to blame for the escalating conflict? Is peace possible? What are people's hopes and fears? And most of all, what kinds of stories about North Korea are told on the ground? In the US, Japan, South Korea, China, and Europe, the answers to these questions certainly will differ. Ordinary citizens in each country are most affected by the decisions made on the international stage, and only through the media can the concerns of the citizen reach the ear of the policymaker, as well as through certainly their legislatures. So like many other problems, big problems on the international stage, this one is not really solvable or even manageable by any one country. There has to be international cooperation, and as the Scowcroft Center recently emphasized in a landmark report that was called A Strategy for the Trans-Pacific Century, today's international order has really requires multilateral approaches, even as it's under great stress. And this also means that the Pacific communities and the Atlantic communities have to work much, much more closely together, because none of these problems are walled off by any boundaries in Europe or Asia, or for that matter, the Middle East or other places. So this event is one part of the conversation, but we've been addressing these for quite some time. You might have noticed earlier in the year, one of the Atlantic Council's memos to the President addressed North Korea in late June. We also have published issue briefs called Managing the Korean Conundrum and Northeast Asian Futures. And the strategy I mentioned was the culmination of over a year of work by our Asia Pacific Strategy Task Force. And so even with this event today, the conversation certainly won't end, as next week, please stay tuned in this room, but it'll be much larger. We'll have a major conference in partnership with the Korea Foundation to address the continuing and growing importance of the U.S.-Korea relationship, not just for the Korean Peninsula, not just for Asia, but for the world and for the advancement of global interests. We have one confirmed keynote already, and that is Secretary of Commerce Wilbur Ross, but please stay tuned for other news, and I think the invitations went out this morning, so we certainly welcome your participation in that. Now let's turn to today's panel and how ordinary citizens' views are being affected by and are affecting this crisis, although I really hesitate to call it a crisis, but I'd welcome the panelists' views as well on that. And so I think offering the Korean perspective, we have Ms. Insun Kang, the Bureau Chief of the Chosun Daily. Thank you for coming. And I think you all have more detailed bios, which you can refer to. From the Japanese perspective, we have Mr. Satoshi Ogawa, the Bureau Chief of Yomiuri Shimbun. For England and more broadly Europe, we have Mr. James Palmer, the Asia editor of Foreign Policy. For the United States, we have Mr. David Sanger, the National Security Correspondent of the New York Times. And offering a Chinese perspective, we have the Scowcroft Center's own Dr. Junsheng Wang. He's a visiting senior fellow from China in the Atlantic Council's Brent Scowcroft Center. A few quick reminders. First, if you haven't done so, we really welcome your participation in the audience survey. We'll be using Mentimeter during our discussion, so please go to menti.com, enter the code 709028 to follow along. And the question we're asking is, which of the three pathways you see listed there is most appropriate for achieving peace on the Korean Peninsula? I'll be watching your votes during the course of the discussion, and we'll return to that to discuss what you're saying, what you're telling us during this overall event. Second, please join the conversation online on Twitter by following the Scowcroft Center at AC Scowcroft. We'll be using the hashtag ACAsia. As a reminder, this event will be webcast live and is on the record. I'm sure our journalists would welcome that part of it. And now I'd like to turn to each of our journalists to give brief opening remarks. We'll have a discussion, and then I really want to open it up to you. So please start thinking about your questions and your succinct comments for our really great panel here. And so firstly, I'd like to hear from Ms. Kang of the Chosun Daily. Ms. Kang?
Okay. Good morning, everyone. And I would like to thank you for arranging this timely event for Atlantic Council, and thank you all coming here. Well, this is about how ordinary people perceive the North Korean nuclear crisis. So just let me start with my tiny episode that I had a long time ago. I think it was 2013. I was in Seoul as a vice editor for political section. So I was in charge of all those news related with North Korea. We got the news that North Korea conducted a nuclear test. So we hastily arranged a edition meeting for the next day's newspaper. And then when the meeting's over, somehow I felt like calling to my daughter, who was in college at the time. So I made a phone call to her and told her, come home as early as you can because North Korea did a nuclear test. She laughed. And then, Mom, why should I come home early due to the North Korean nuclear test? It doesn't affect me at all. I'm the only student in this college who got a call from Mom that you should come home early because of North Korea. So I told that story to my colleagues and friends, and they all laughed at me because, I mean, that's a very serious threat that we lived under, but there's nothing that you can change, with your effort or your thoughts. So this is really a serious situation if something serious happens in North Korea. And when you look at the stock market, in 2006, there was a first round of nuclear test, and the stock market was heavily influenced, and it take about more than 20 days to recover it. Since then, there are five rounds of nuclear tests, but there was not that serious influence on stock market. It was plummeted, but it recovered it in a few hours or a few days. So the living under that threat or risk is embedded in your life. So we are getting more and more used to live under that situation. So, we have been living in that situation for more than 20 years. And then Koreans know, I guess no one knows better than Koreans do about how serious that crisis is and how dangerous it is. But sometimes, I guess the foreign media, like U.S. media, they reported that Koreans seem very indifferent to the crisis because they just keep on going. They do not really care about what's happening. But I don't think that's simple. The situation is that simple. The psychology behind that is very complicated. As I told you, it's a serious situation, but you cannot change it however hard you try. So people look just indifferent, but they knew how serious it is. And now it's 2017, and this year is very different from previous years because North Korea has proved their capability to lead, their ICBM capabilities to reach the mainland U.S. For me, it seems to me that it's a kind of a game changer because the way United States handled the situation looked very different from what they did last year or the day before than that. So, and particularly the people, not only me, but Koreans, they look more concerned about the situation. And there are other issues like we have a new president. We have a President Trump and we have a Kim Jong-un. That Kim Jong-un and Trump, that structure is different from Kim Jong-il and Obama. And people feel more danger than they did before because of there's more unpredictability and uncertainty. But recently, I think what's more dangerous is that there is a pattern. It gets North Korea provoked, and then United States reacted, and then there's a kind of period. It's getting calm, and then North Korea provoked again, and United States reacted again. Even though it's fiercely, I saw the kind of pattern. So it seems to me that it's really dangerous, and also it's hard to find the real momentum to solve this, very important but difficult problems. Yeah.
Thank you very much, and I really want to come back to you on your very thoughtful comments. Why don't we turn to Mr. Ogawa now for a Japanese journalist perspective.
Okay, thank you. Japanese people have shown a relatively tougher stance to North Korea than people in South Korea, Europe, the United States, and China. According to a Yomiuri poll conducted in April, 64% Japanese support the U.S. putting more pressure on North Korea, including military pressure, while the majority are cautious about holding talks. Some of you may wonder why people known for their pacifism support a maximum pressure campaign, which might provoke a second Korean War. So let me explain. So firstly, Japanese people have been very tough on North Korea before it accelerated nuclear and ballistic missile development. This feeling has been reinforced mainly through the issue of abduction of Japanese nationals. In 2002, Prime Minister Koizumi visited North Korea and met with Kim Jong-il, which I covered there. Kim Jong-il acknowledged that these abductions were the work of persons affiliated with North Korea in the past and offered his apologies. He informed Japan that out of abducted Japanese citizens, 5 were alive, 8 were dead. This admission were worse than Japanese people expected before the summit. So Japanese people were furious at North Korea. In following years, government of Japan asked North Korea to reinvestigate on that the claim which 8 had died, but North Korea has dealt with this request very dishonestly. As a result, even ordinary Japanese people believe that even if discussions are held with North Korea, it would be impossible to expect satisfactory results. So now that I have explained the emotional climate surrounding North Korea in Japan, so I'd like to talk about Japan's response to North Korea's recent provocations. Recent polls have shown that 90% of Japanese people are concerned about North Korea, of which 60% are extremely concerned. So this September poll also showed that the majority of Japanese people wanted to strengthen pressure toward North Korea, while only 40% called for negotiation. This is why Prime Minister Abe, who has ruled out dialogue at this juncture, won largely in the general election held in late October. But the latest poll taken after the general election showed that there is a shift in the public opinion. Now, 48% want to negotiate with North Korea, while 41% wants to strengthen pressure. So there is a reason why this shift is occurring. During the election campaign, many media reported Prime Minister Abe had decided to hold a snap election because he had indication from President Trump that the situation in North Korea would deteriorate next year to a point where it would be impossible for Japan to hold a general election. So you can easily find these rumors circulating on social media networks that US might conduct preemptive strike after Christmas. Obviously, a war followed by retaliation is the absolute worst-case scenario for Japanese people. Another worst-case scenario for Japan would be a future in which the US would accept a nuclear North Korea. Dr. Susan Rice, former National Security Advisor to President Obama, wrote in her op-ed in August that history shown that we can tolerate nuclear weapons in North Korea, and we can rely on traditional deterrence. Japanese people didn't like this idea. The Gallup International conducted an international poll with 14 countries, including Japan, in this fall, on the question, which solution do you favor? Diplomatic solution or military solution? 49% of Japanese favored military solution, which was the highest among the 14 countries polled. In this case, I think military solution will be executed by the United States, not by Japan. So why this surprisingly high number? Japan is aware of the fact that they will be the first target if North Korea uses a nuclear weapon. They are also aware of how horrible a nuclear disaster would be, and having experienced it before on its own soil. And they know how mad and unpredictable the North Korean leader is. So with regard to the traditional deterrence, government of Japan doesn't buy her argument. So a senior MOFA official told me that Kim Jong-un doesn't care about his country and citizens at all, so he may be willing to use nuclear weapons against Japan if he believes he is willing to be killed. So this has led some Japanese to think military solution before North Korea completes its nuclear weapons production is better than a situation where they are blackmailed by the dictator. So in short, Japan wants to avoid a war with retaliation. At the same time, it wants to avoid living with nuclear North Korea, if possible. I think the former feeling is stronger in the ordinary Japanese people, but some people see a possible wild card in which the US will conduct preemptive war with no retaliation from North Korea. In other words, a scenario in which the US would annihilate the whole North Korean missile and rockets. So I think it is unlikely that option for obtaining nuclear weapon will ever rise in Japan. I want to elaborate this point later, but my time has expired, so I'll stop here.
Thank you, Mr. Ogawa. Very, very great grist for us to delve into, especially your polling statistics. Mr. Palmer, we'd love to hear the view. You're representing all of Europe here on the question of the nuclear North Korea.
I'm afraid I'm actually going to talk mostly about China because that's why I work. My knowledge of Europe at this point is about 20 years old. I've lived in Beijing for the last 14 years. So the unusual thing about North Korea in Chinese perception is that it's a problem that simultaneously barely worries the mass of the public and causes acute anxiety among the policy elite and the party elite. Now, it's always very hard to tell public opinion in China because polling is bad. It's especially on any issue that's perceived as politically sensitive, it's very hard to get accurate information. And our view as journalists is limited to an extremely small slice of the Chinese population that's highly educated for the most part, often more xenophiliac than the average Chinese, more inclined to Western views, and lives in Beijing, Shanghai, or Shenzhen. So, but with those caveats, and judging as best we can from a very limited media environment and an increasingly limited social media environment, most Chinese don't worry about North Korea in the way that Americans or Japanese or even Europeans do. That is, they don't see North Korea as an imminent threat to China or an imminent threat to world peace because they simply don't think about it that much. It doesn't occupy a strong place in the Chinese popular imagination. In part, that's because it's not given a lot of emphasis in Chinese media. In part, it's because what feelings there are about North Korea tend to be filtered through political lenses to do with the US or to do with China's own development rather than the nuclear program. So for the average Chinese citizen, I would say, they think of North Korea simply as the slightly backwards, slightly stupid neighbor. You'll often get references to North Korea in Chinese conversation, but those references are mostly to do with comparing China to North Korea. So we're talking about in the 1970s when China was like North Korea, or with saying one of the very popular phrases online for a while as the sort of renewed reactionary authoritarianism under Xi Jinping has started to crack down, has been this notion of calling China West Korea. The reference being that China is becoming more and more like North Korea. So so when it's discussed, North Korea is this sort of dictatorial reference point. But the nuclear issue gets very little play. It's not talked about much. It's not thought about much. If there's any, in terms of any kind of conflict, the vast majority of Chinese incline towards South Korea because South Korea is a place that they experience on a cultural and everyday level. Whereas once, in the 1960s, North Korean media was almost the only foreign media allowed into China, and everybody Chinese of that generation can still talk about the Little Flower Girl, this big Korean movie of the time. Now, South Korea, K-pop, films, big dominant influence in Chinese culture. But even as ordinary people are not thinking about it much, the Chinese policy elite and Chinese policymakers are very afraid about it. And you can tell this in part because it's one of a vanishingly small number of issues nowadays in China in which there's an actual debate, and that debate takes place somewhat in the public sphere, visibly, that there are different camps within the party on North Korea, ranging from those who essentially see it as a rogue state, as a danger to Chinese prosperity, as ungrateful, and as stuck in the past to those at the other extreme who maintain the old, as close as lips and teeth formula that sees North Korea as China's only ally. And you get this discussion played out in the normal sort of fractured and limited way of Chinese media through different forums. When I worked for Chinese state media, which I did for several years, you could see it visibly shifting, see the environment visibly shifting from week to week, because who was allowed to speak also depended upon the relationship with North Korea at the time. So, for instance, Zhang Lianggui, who's at the party school, who's one of the funniest and one of the most outspoken North Korean critics of North Korea, would literally go from being allowed to be quoted in the media one week to almost, so actually I saw it happen within a space of hours once, that a reporter called him for a story to get a quote, and by the time she filed, several hours later, was told that he wasn't allowed to be quoted in the media at the moment. So we can see this very fierce, actually, debate going on within the party reflected through these sort of fractured images, this sort of sense of who can and can't speak. And I think that's going to continue for a while. I don't think a clear Chinese policy position has emerged on North Korea. I think there's real contention going on as to what to do and how to act. And that's been the case for ever since Kim Jong-un came in. And I see no end to it in the near future.
Thanks very much, Mr. Palmer. And that's very, very helpful to get a better understanding of the Chinese domestic scene, including both the public and the elites. David Sanger, would love to hear your thoughts now from the American perspective.
Sure. Well, thanks, Barry. And it's great to be back at the Atlantic Council, and frequently here, and always impressed with its many programs and its great diversity of views. I'm not sure that I'm in a great position to tell you what the American public view is, other than to make the observation that what has captivated Americans these days about the North Korean crisis, and I'll take up your invitation on this, Barry, in a moment and explain to you why I do think it is a crisis, but of a different kind. What's captivated them is the fact that it now appears likely that North Korean missiles can range the United States. That does not necessarily mean they can hit a specific target in the United States, but certainly the missile that we saw last week, which was getting close to sort of an SS-18 class Russian missile, if they can't figure it out in the next couple of years how to hit any American city, then they should all be fired, although in North Korea, usually the penalty is worse than getting fired. But they clearly have a technology that will enable them to hit American cities. This has captivated Americans who forget about the fact that the North Koreans have long been able to hit Seoul or Tokyo or even Beijing with nuclear weapons for years on end. And it is only because, for the reasons that you heard from Mrs. Kang and others, that those populations have decided to sort of live with it. And so the question for the United States is, can you live with this or can't you? It's not the first time Americans have faced that question. If you go back into the declassified Kennedy and Johnson papers, you will find a very similar debate about whether or not to strike Lop Nor, the Chinese testing site, was, and I think still is, a major Chinese nuclear site, because of the fear that the United States could not live with a Chinese nuclear capability. Well, we've lived with one since 1964 and 1965, and we don't wake up in the morning concerned every day whether or not Xi Jinping is going to wake up and decide to hit the United States. Now, we don't wake up and worry about that because the Chinese government is deeply invested in the international economy and in the United States. And the Iranians, when we went through the negotiations with them in recent years, before they had any weapons, fortunately, were deeply invested in international markets, oil markets, and wanted to be deeply invested in the United States. North Korea is different. And the reason, Barry, that I would say that it is a crisis is that if you define your crisis only as an urgent issue that has popped up right in front of you, then it's not. But this is much closer to what my colleague Graham Allison at the Harvard Kennedy School refers to as a Cuban Missile Crisis in slow motion, which is exactly what has happened. Over 5 presidencies, every American president has had to make a decision about whether or not a marginal improvement in North Korean capability was worth taking some kind of military action. And every one of them has gone through the same calculus, and that calculus has been whatever advance they've made, really it's not worth risking Seoul. George H.W. Bush made that decision when we first discovered Yongbyon, the main nuclear facility that the North Koreans have, and which I wrote about from Tokyo in the late 80s as a foreign correspondent. You saw President Clinton have to make that decision in the 1994 nuclear crisis, which was the closest I think we've come to reviving the Korean War, although most Americans were pretty much tuned out to it at the moment of how close we came to conflict. Could have been that it was the same weekend the O.J. chase was going on the LA highways, but who knows? Okay. George W. Bush had to go make that decision when the North Koreans moved their plutonium from the first time from supervised, well-known pools at Yongbyon out to places unknown for reprocessing. And I remember on those particular weekends when that was happening, being told by very senior members of the Bush administration, I was White House correspondent at the time, don't worry, North Korea is a problem we can handle later on. Iraq is the one you need to worry about. And then Barack Obama had to make that decision through a series of nuclear tests, the first of which happened in the Bush administration. Every one of them decided that it wasn't worth the confrontation. What's different now? That President Trump, before he came into office on January 2, issued naturally a tweet that said that the missile launches that could reach the United States weren't going to happen. And now they've happened, he's also gone on one greater, which is to say that he's going to be the president who solves the North Korean problem. So let's look at your 3 options up here, because they get to this question. Which one of these 3 would solve the problem? Well, confrontation, increased sanctions, ultimatum, military action. You might, with military action, delay the problem, but unless you led to complete regime change, all you're going to do is drive the program underground. And that's one of the reasons that you see so much opposition within the military to taking these steps, apart from the grievous effects it could have on Americans and the Korean Peninsula, on Seoul, on Japan. The second option you've got is compromise, sustained engagement and increased diplomacy toward denuclearization. Sounds great. We all love this sound in Washington, except that the North Koreans have said that they have a weapon to stay and that it's going to stay. And frankly, for those of you who think the North Koreans are irrational, that decision, that position is a highly rational one, because if they are thinking about regime survival, and they've looked at Gaddafi in Libya, and they've looked at other examples, holding on to their nuclear weapon is probably their best chance at regime survival. And your third option, so they've said denuclearization is off the table. We're happy to talk to you, but not about denuclearization. And your third option is cooperation, multilateral discussion, and recognition of the DPRK as a nuclear state. Well, if we recognize the DPRK as a nuclear state, you've now basically also recognized the Pakistanis, and you've pretty much walked away from 4 or 5 decades of what the concept of the NPT was going to be all about. And while no American president would want to stand up and say so, that would be the result. And that's why no American president has acknowledged them formally as a nuclear state, while it's clear they have nuclear weapons, and it's pretty clear they have no intention of giving them up. So I don't think you've got the right frame on these questions, Barry, because the reason for that is it's going to end up being some mix of these groups. And if the Iran negotiations are any particular example, you're going to end up doing a combination of economic sanctions, covert action. We forget that Olympic Games, the operation against Iran, was probably as responsible for bringing them to the table as the sanctions were, and the threat of military action in an effort to drive the diplomacy. I'm not at all persuaded that in the case of the North Koreans that will succeed, and it's why I think that the chances of conflict here are probably in the 25 or 30% range, which is a lot higher than I think what you would find among the public in South Korea, maybe Japan, and certainly in the United States. I hope they're right and I'm wrong.
Thanks very much, David. You've also given us a lot to chew on. And why don't we turn to Dr. Wang now for another view from China. Dr. Wang?
It's really my great pleasure to be here. I think North Korea nuclear issue is very controversial in China. So I think it's very hard to speak how Chinese maybe think about this issue. But I think from my personal viewpoint, because I engaged in North Korea nuclear issue maybe for almost more than 10 years. I think for Chinese policy is quite clear. As the final goal, as we know, peace, denuclearization, I think from Chinese perspective must be restored. As we can see, maybe North Korea has accelerated its nuclearization. I think from Chinese perspective, it's very urgent to rein its ambitions. But as the how to see the essence of this issue, to be very frank, I think we have a very quite different perspective with US. From I think most all the Chinese, if you ask the all Chinese perspective, I think you will be told, okay, this issue, maybe US and North Korea both should be responsible. Because from our viewpoint, okay, North Korea, okay, they are outdated security, but for here, maybe Cold War structure, yeah, mindset. So from Chinese side, okay, you too should be responsible. But from the reality is, okay, we always receive the criticism from US, from Western world. So actually, we can see what North Korea and US want most only can be satisfied from each other. This proved again, okay, that this issue maybe US and North Korea maybe should be responsible. So because of this recognition of the essence of this issue, I think for the approach, how to realize, how to resolve, I think also is very different viewpoint from here. From Chinese perspective, I think we think, okay, you two, I mean US and North Korea, you should have a direct dialogue to resolve it. At the same time, you should make concessions with each other at the same time. But okay, we can see from United States, because I arrived here for almost 1 month, I heard a lot of maybe voice, like, okay, punish North Korea. Even some people think, okay, we should punish China. So I think this is just because the essence of this issue, we have a very different perspective. So I think I should stop here now, okay?
Sure, although I'm not going to let you completely stop, but thank you for your thoughts. I think it's impossible to summarize these excellent interventions, but what I heard was sort of two types of variables here: new developments on the ground and in the region, and also new actors, new players. And I think I want to start with Ms. Kang first. I mean, you said the North Korean ICBM is a game changer. That's a new development. And you also said the U.S. response has been very different. And certainly there's different actors. President Moon is new, President Trump is new, Kim Jong-un is kind of new. President Xi isn't new, but he now has a new stature in light of the 19th Party Congress. Prime Minister Abe has just been through an election on October 22nd. And so how does South Korea think about the new players versus the new developments? I mean, do they think the ICBM is really more of a game changer than President Trump, or less, is the question I have. And do they really think that engagement, which really was President Moon's platform, I believe, and one of the major things for which he was elected president, and the Atlantic Council hosted him in New York in September, do they think engagement's going to work without more pressure? And I probably asked you too many questions, but please let me know your thoughts.
Well, I mean, when you look back upon last 20 years of negotiation and pressures and dialogue and all those mixture of things, and what we have seen is that there's not much success on that. I mean, sometimes it looks like we have attained some kind of midterm goal, but it turned out actually kind of nothing after that. And then while we were doing all those efforts, I mean, later we found out that during that period of time, North Korea has never stopped developing nuclear weapons. So, I mean, Korea, as I listened to other panels, which has a different from this different country and different background, I think for Koreans it's really hard to say that, because okay, if military option seems effective, let's do that. We cannot say that, because that means we can take a risk of war on Korean Peninsula. So let's do engagement, because it's slow, but I mean it's more peaceful. But you never know what's going to happen at the end of the road. So at the end of the road, there's a nuclear North Korea. It could be possible. So it's really hard to choose between those two options. But I think engagement is really a kind of a easy choice for policymakers, because it doesn't make that dramatic result, I mean, in a short term. But I'm not really trust that is the option that we can take now.
Let me ask all of the panelists, and then please ask each other questions too. And then shortly I'm going to turn to the audience, so if you want to catch my eye, I'll turn to you for questions and comments. Let me ask a longer term question. We've been really focused on the near term and what measures to take in 2018 and 2019 and 2020. But if we project the current trends forward to, say, 2022, 2025, we're talking about a North Korea with 50 or 100 ICBMs. It's starting to look more like Pakistan's inventory and capabilities. And what are the public's reactions in your countries to that development in the medium term? It's not really that far off, especially for the purposes of strategic planning. My biggest worry, but I don't want to taint your answer, is that the South Korean public, the American public, the Japanese public will lose confidence in these alliances. They'll step back and they'll say, we're spending all this money and we're doing all of these military activities and we're getting less secure. It's not clear that deterrence will hold. We don't know about Kim Jong-un's decision-making process, and we certainly don't know if a crisis could lead, or an accident could lead to a crisis, which could lead to war. And then I worry about the durability and health of the military alliances that really are the essential fabric of maintaining security in the Asia Pacific. If that goes away, then we're going to have much bigger problems than how to curtail or slow North Korea's arsenal. What are your public thoughts, might be your public thoughts on those questions?
Well, I mean, yes, that is why South Koreans need, I mean, there are lots of people who want to have our own nuclear programs, our nuclear weapons to defend ourselves, or we need to reintroduce tactical nuclear weapons back to Korea as we did before. I think before, I mean, as you mentioned, that the reason why people support that idea is that they do not really trust United States. I mean, U.S. always told us, I mean, we have a kind of wide umbrella, nuclear umbrella for you, so don't worry about that. You don't need to make your own nuclear weapons. I mean, there's NPT, so you keep that promise. But when the umbrella is broken, then what is going to happen to us? I mean, well, we have heard, dozens of times during the presidential campaign last year, that President Trump said, I mean, Koreans, I mean, you have to pay more for the military base in Korea and militaries in Korea. So, I mean, if you don't want to pay more, you can have your own nuclear weapons. That's what President said. So, I mean, people are more skeptical about what United States will do us for next 20 years or 30 years. We have a mutual defense treaties, but does it go forever? I mean, there's a suspicions comes out of, people, so that's why they want to have their own means and ways to defend ourselves.
With regard to the option for nuclear armament, currently such voice is negligible in Japan. So only those who don't believe the U.S. extended deterrence is enough, or the advocate for self-reliance defense support this idea. So if the more Japanese people think the U.S. is unwilling to defend Japan, the idea of nuclear armament would gain momentum. But I think that it is unlikely that such a major shift in public opinion will occur, because two reasons. One is Japanese people feel very strongly about nuclear weapons. As I mentioned, they are the only nation to have suffered atomic attack. And the other reason is that Japan has a passive defense strategy, so-called exclusive defense, and limit the possession of defense capability to the minimum necessary to self-defense. It means the nuclear weapon don't meet such criteria will be unconstitutional. So if the government of Japan wants to go nuclear, it needs to change revise the constitution or change the interpretation of the constitution. And if I don't think that instead, I think Japan would reinforce its missile defense or surveillance capability, and in addition to that, consider acquiring strike capability, such as cruise missile, long-range cruise missiles, and or the amending Japan free nuclear principles, especially the banning the introduction of nuclear weapons. So such measures will be considered before the Japan is going nuclear.
Thanks. I want to turn to David, and then we'll turn to the audience right after. So please raise your hand if you have thoughts or questions. David.
First, I'd like to address Ms. Kang's point about President Trump, because I think it was a very important one. He did say during the campaign that he did not have an objection to Japan and South Korea going nuclear. He said it to me in the course of an interview in which I was sort of pressing him on the longer-term strategic implications of his comments that we could pull back from the region. And I was making the point to him that if we did, it would fuel that part of the South Korean and Japanese public who have long argued in favor of an independent nuclear deterrent. At the same time, I think it was probably the first time he'd ever really engaged the issue. And you could sort of see as we were discussing it that he was sort of taking this on for the first time and thinking about it for the first time, which isn't enormously surprising considering he had spent his life as a real estate developer, and real estate developers don't spend a whole lot of time thinking about the long-term questions of proliferation, right? So it's been interesting to me that in the months since he was inaugurated, he has not repeated that line. He has not at any point that I've heard, at least in public, suggested that South Korea or Japan might need an independent deterrent. I don't know if that's because he's been told that it's not a good thing to suggest or because he's actually changed his mind since then. We haven't discussed it since. The second point, which I think comes out of the discussion among the South Koreans and the Japanese about the need for missile defense and so forth, there is a tendency in both South Korean politics and Japanese politics, different as they are, to try to throw a big cloud around the question of anyone having to answer, can we live with a nuclear-capable North Korea? So they talk about depending on the US, they talk about deterrence, they talk about building up missile defenses, all of which you may need to go do. But they don't talk very much about can we or can we not live with this? Because that then drives you to the uncomfortable political question of what do you do about it under current circumstances, when it's clear they do have weapons, and as you say, if you just move the line forward, would be at 50 to 100 by 2022. This is one of those examples where the question of whether conventional deterrence will work depends on how you define the problem you are trying to solve. If what you are trying to prevent is a unilateral attack on Washington or Los Angeles or Tokyo or Seoul, yeah, the same thing that deterred the Soviet Union will deter the North Koreans. We don't think they're suicidal. If, on the other hand, you are worried about a blackmail situation in which there is a conventional attack on Seoul and the threat of escalating it to nuclear, if you are concerned that in the midst of a North Korean collapse situation, suddenly there would be a scramble for those 50 or 100 nuclear weapons, and you don't know if one of them would be launched or detonated on site in the course of that. If you are worried about an accident, a confrontation like the one that led to the North Korean sinking of the South Korean Corsair a few years ago, about that escalating, then conventional deterrence isn't going to work. And so it's a multi-layer problem, and you have to really define what it is you're trying to deter. So you're not hearing much of this in the political debate. It's a little subtle for a public debate to have the question of, are we simply trying to deter in a conventional way that we did in the Cold War, or are we trying to deter against a much more complex set of escalating events?
Well, James and Junsheng, what might be the Chinese reaction to this 2022 scenario or 25 scenario that I've sketched out?
So,
Okay. Yeah, I think following the very recent years, frequently missile test and nuclear test made by North Korea, I think for Chinese public opinion, from Chinese perspective, I think maybe there are some people, more and more people have a negative opinion about North Korea. Yeah, just like our panelists mentioned, maybe more and more positive opinion image shift to South Korea. Because one reason, as you know, the nuclear test location is very close with China. The second reason is every North Korea made a nuclear test or missile test will cause China's relations with US, South Korea more complicated. So I think from Chinese perspective, we really do not want to say what such kind of activities. But at the same time, I wanted to emphasize there are more and more Chinese have more complaints about the United States. Yeah, because every North Korean nuclear test, you will want to exert more pressure. Okay, it's okay. But most of the pressures we can say the biggest sacrifice is Chinese. Yeah, at the same time, what we really want, such as dialogue, but U.S. you didn't listen to. Yeah. At the same time, you gave Chinese a lot of pressure. So I think maybe it's a parallel. Yeah, we have more complaints for North Korea. At the same time, I think it's similar for U.S. Yeah.
So very quickly, because obviously we want to get to audience questions, 3 possible scenarios. The very optimistic one, which is that North Korea's nuclear arsenal keeps growing, but North Korea's economy also keeps growing at 4%, which is what it is now, we think, maybe even higher. And it starts to engage with China more, it opens up a little bit, cross-border trade increases. That's good for everyone, that's also very good for the Chinese relationship and for the sense of possible integration into the future. And that's been, I think, the story somewhat missing, that, you know, the North Korean economy is doing strangely well. There is this possibility of what China has always wanted, which is, why don't you just do what we did? Come on, buddy, come into the world. Come and, you know, open up, let's get some business going, let's send a bunch of guys down to open factories. The bad scenario is South Korea adopts an independent nuclear deterrent. Even worse, Japan adopts an independent nuclear deterrent. That sparks mass nationalism and near hysteria in China, generated through the press. We saw already, even with THAAD, a more or less purely defensive system, 18 months of intense attacks on South Korea by China, by the Chinese press, economic boycott, lots of damage done there. South Korean nukes returning to South Korea means even more nukes coming to Japan is a pitch of hysteria that I can't even imagine for China for at least, you know, a year or two. The really, really bad scenario is among all this testing, something goes wrong and the effects go cross-border, in which case you have a massive public relations crisis in China, because the initial impulse will be to attempt to cover up that this has happened. I know people who have worked with the Chinese on nuclear disaster scenario testing, and the first reaction of the Chinese government of the Chinese authorities in these scenarios is always to attempt to cover it up, and that's not going to be able to be covered up. It will spiral into a situation where you have public pushback, where the government feels compelled to do something, and where things could go very wrong very quickly, especially in a China where the decision-making process is getting increasingly dependent upon one person's whim, and one person's not particularly well-informed whim at this point. So there is I think positive possibilities, things that are being missed, but there's also the chance of just a massive ratcheting up of tensions caused by other countries' understandable reactions to North Korea that prompt even more nationalism, even more kind of defensiveness in China.
As we go to questions, I would also add that in that scenario, the significant increase in U.S. and South Korean and Japanese military capabilities in the region would make THAAD look rather benign to, I think, the Chinese military. I think the first question was in the far back corner right there. If you could identify yourself and keep your questions brief, that would be great.
Hello, I'm Elaine Serrao. Thank you very much for this excellent presentation. It gives a very diverse overview from all the different players. My question has to do with, has one factor been possibly overlooked as an element which could potentially trigger a military action? Not necessarily a nuclear military action, but a military action. The current, this would probably be to Mr. Sanger. Mr. Sanger, how would you view the current developments here in Washington, D.C., the pressure that's being put on the Oval Office with the investigations, and the tension that creates within the White House? Do you see the potential of some kind of military action to be done, not just to address the circumstances in Korea, but to actually distract from the major issues that are taking place right now? Thank you.
Well, not the first time that people have asked the question, could there be what's called the wag the dog scenario, which for our non-Americans who are here was a not very good movie that came out, I don't know, I'm probably dating, Barry and I are probably the only two people on the entire panel who remember it. But basically had a president who was trying to distract from a scandal at home and starts a small war abroad. I think that would be difficult in this case absent a major provocation on the part of the North Koreans, and I'll describe that provocation in a minute. Only because there is such high scrutiny about this discussion, and because it's no secret that the Pentagon, through Secretary Mattis, the State Department, through, at least for now, Secretary Tillerson, and others, have made the argument that this has got to be a diplomacy-first approach. Now, what could change that? Intelligence that one of these test launches is actually aimed at going right at Guam or off the coast of the United States. A debate, an internal debate, if they believe the North Koreans are going to carry through on their threat to conduct an atmospheric test. That is to say, launch a missile and have it detonate above ground or above the sea rather than underground, as they've always done. I will remind you that we and the Soviets and the Chinese all did atmospheric testing, in our case, and the Soviet case until the Limited Test Ban Treaty in the early 60s. I think the Chinese did their last one in 1980 or thereabouts. So these have been done before, but the environment for this is new and different. And it's an interesting question, would the United States act to intercede with that? Third possibility I could imagine is trying to take out a North Korean missile in the air with your anti-missile systems, but that runs a huge risk if you miss, right? And thus would reveal that the anti-ballistic missile systems that we've been investing $300 billion on over the past 40 or 50 years might not be able to handle a single weapon coming in. So these are complicated enough, and I don't have any indication so far that the pressure the president's been under, at least to this point, would necessarily influence them in any way.
Take more questions, and by the way, any panelist, I'm giving you carte blanche to answer any question. Yes, right here in the third row.
Hi, I'm Shigao, and first, I'm from China. I want to give you an update on how Chinese people think about North Korea nuclear issue, because in Liaoning province, which province located just next to North Korea, and every time North Korea conducted a nuclear test, people who lived in Liaoning province, they felt the earthquake. They worried about the nuclear material leaks and also the refugee problem across the border. So Chinese people do think it and treat it very seriously. I think in the world, there's no such country like China who has 4 neighbors, literally, who claims they have nuclear weapons. So Chinese people do really worried about the nuclear crisis happened in North Korea. And I have a question for Ms. Kang and Mr. Ogawa. Do you think, how likely will Japan and South Korea will develop its own nuclear weapons in the future as long as the crisis increased? Thank you very much.
Would you like to answer that succinctly? I think we addressed it a little bit during the panel, but maybe a quick summary of what you've said.
Yes, I think that as Japan, it's the only nation to have suffered atomic attacks. It is unlikely that the Japanese people want to obtain their own nuclear deterrence.
I guess it depends on it depends on the trust level that we have with the U.S. I mean, as long as there's a trust between the U.S.-ROK alliance, I think we don't really push that idea into really implementation of making something. But I mean, when you really need to do that one, it's really, really dangerous situation and kind of extreme choice. Yes.
Just to be clear for the audience, when you say trust, I think you're saying trust that in a nuclear crisis, the U.S. would threaten to use its nuclear weapons in defense of South Korea. It's what we call the extended nuclear deterrence or the nuclear umbrella, if that's what you're saying by trust.
Right. Yes.
And I have to say, that people, it's easy to forget that North Korea really is only the third country since the end of World War II to be able to credibly threaten the U.S. homeland with nuclear weapons. There's other countries that have nuclear weapons, but they're not considered to be adversarial. Countries like the United Kingdom, France, I think
5 years.
Relations are going okay right now. But so this is only the third time. Russia, or the Soviet Union at the time, China, and now North Korea. So this is a pretty big deal. In terms of U.S. history, at least, and U.S. The U.S. perspective and context. And so I think it's a new question in some ways that hopefully in the administration's forthcoming documents, it'll start talking to the American public about the need to extend this nuclear umbrella and what it means in terms of a sacrifice of the American public itself on behalf of the South Korean public.
So that's Korean public's concern. I mean, now North Korea has ICBM capability that you can reach to the U.S. mainland, and then now it's not a security threat or security issues in East Asia or Korean Peninsula. It's a direct threat to United States. So the way to handle the situation could be different. So that's where our concerns come from.
Great. Next question. Why don't we go here in the middle?
Thank you for your presentations. I'm Junie Kim with the Korea Economic Institute, and I had a question for Mr. Singer. You've had a number of articles talking about U.S. cyber operations to disrupt North Korea's missile program. And in light of the most recent tests, I want to see your opinion about the administration's trust in this as a viable option, or if they think it's something ineffective.
It's a really interesting question, and because cyber operations are so new, only within the past 10 years is the possibility, and really only since the operation against Iran starting in 2010 as a sort of concrete reality, we don't have a lot of experience with how successful they can be. And then add to that all of the secrecy that is that surrounds any set of cyber operations. In the case of the program that President Obama ordered in 2014, or ordered to be accelerated, it was a combination of cyber and electronic warfare steps against the Musadan missile, which was the main missile that Kim Jong-un was testing until last fall. Intermediate range, didn't pose the kind of threat to the U.S. homeland that the more recent missiles have been. Failure rate was running around 88%. It's based on an old Russian design where the failure rate should have been closer to 10 or 14%. The big issue is how much of that 88% failure rate can you attribute to cyber operations, and how much can you attribute to bad parts, bad engineering, bad judgment, bad weather, everything else that can happen in North Korean launch. The reason it jumped out at us was that the North Koreans have been pretty successful in their launches prior to this, and pretty successful since Kim Jong-un last October or so suspended the Musadan tests. If you think about the tests that have happened over the past year, only one or two have really gone awry. And that's much more within our experience with our own missile testing. So that raises two possibilities. One is they've designed their way around this. They figured it out and come up with a way to avoid it. Second possibility, the United States is now reserving its cyber weapons for when it really needs them, when they think a launch that is truly threatening is possible. And even then, of course, with cyber, you never have the certainty of whether it'll work.
I have a two-part follow-up for our Chinese guests here, or representatives of guests of the public. What's the Chinese view on these reported cyber operations? And would this be something the Chinese military would consider to keep North Korea from developing nuclear weapons?
Okay. I do not know much about the cyber security, cyber attack from maybe US or from North Korea. I do not know that much about that. But I think from Chinese perspective, maybe such kind of approach maybe just temporary. From Chinese side, we really think, okay, if we want to resolve this issue, maybe in addition to sanction, maybe dialogue is very important. Just as I mentioned earlier, because we think, okay, the essence, or maybe we can say the problem of this issue, maybe you two countries maybe has your own responsibility. So you should have a dialogue. You should find some way to meet each other's legitimacy demands. So maybe for cyber attack, I do not think it works. From the long run,
I know. I find it hard to imagine I find it hard to imagine the possibility of a Chinese cyber attack on North Korea, because I think there's been this sort of belief or hope in China that the US will carry this part of the struggle. That, we're going to maybe put some pressure on diplomatically, we're going to put some pressure on economically, but when it comes to actually going and, poking your finger into other countries' internal affairs, as they like to say, we're going to pretend that we don't want the US to do it, but we'd really quite like you to. Now, whether they're actually signaling that in private at all, I don't know. But I think the possibility of the Chinese taking it on themselves seems pretty remote to me.
You're raising to me the interesting proposition of U.S. and Chinese, very guarded collaboration on North Korean cyber targets, but that'll be another.
Worth remembering that until recently, almost all of the internet connections into North Korea ran through China.
Yeah.
And only recently have some opened up through Russia.
Yeah, we haven't really talked about the Russian role here at all, but I think that's potentially very interesting. I also just quickly, there's one point I wanted to pick up on that this last year was talking about, which is that she mentioned refugees in the Liaoning province, and that's one of the biggest single Chinese paranoias / legitimate concerns / threats. The idea of North Korea going and China having to bear the economic, social, and political burden of a massive sudden refugee problem. And they've been worried about that for ages. I remember being told in about 2009 that the real fear was that the refugee problem would create an excuse for international organizations to threaten China's sovereignty, because it would be such a huge crisis that the UN, that the UNHCR would all get involved. And that's more than anything else, I think that the single first Chinese priority, because they don't really feel under threat from North Korean nuclear weapons themselves. I think there isn't really I'm sure they've wargamed them out, but it's not a pressing concern. Is keeping the border at least semi-intact, keeping North Korea going as a functioning state.
Makes sense. Question in the second row here. Maybe we can even take two if we're quick.
Thank you. Patricia Kim from the Council on Foreign Relations. I have a question for Mr. Sanger. So I think you rightly point out that threats and engagement are not disparate strategies, but that they need to be used together. But you also said you don't have much hope that they'll work with North Korea as they did with Iran, and that there's a 25 to 30% chance of some sort of military crisis. So I want to ask you, what is the other 70%? Are you saying that it would be accommodation?
Oh, I didn't know I was going to go right ahead. Ken Meyercourt, TV producer. I attended a panel on Korea last week in which all three of the panelists didn't agree on much, but they did agree that the North Korean regime is not suicidal. If we assume that, then we can count on them not using their nuclear weapons first, only if they come under attack. So we control the situation. In light of the fact that North Korea is years, maybe a decade off from having a deployable nuclear weapon, and that their economy seems to be doing pretty well, according to Mr. Palmer, is it possible that this whole hullabaloo over the nuclear weapons is, in fact, just to justify more stringent economic sanctions to thwart North Korea's economic development? In other words, the same motivation that has caused us to keep an embargo on Cuba for over 60 years.
Okay, David, first question, and then the broader panel can address the last one.
Sure. So Ms. Kim raises a really interesting question. What are the other alternatives? What's the other 70% out here? So one possibility is what the Chinese and the Russians have been arguing for, which is a freeze for freeze or a freeze for something. And this is where the North Koreans would freeze their nuclear development in return for us cutting back or freezing military exercises on the Korean Peninsula, maybe negotiating a peace treaty since the Korean War ended only in an armistice and the North Koreans have been interested in an actual treaty and so forth. The trick for that for the Trump administration would be arguing that it's a way station toward total denuclearization, while the North Koreans will be out here saying, no, this is a freeze that will freeze an existing nuclear status quo, and we're never going to denuclearize. That's the hard part. If you have a president who's declared he's going to solve the problem, what a freeze for freeze does is basically enshrine the status quo. Now, there are those who argue, including Bill Perry, the former defense secretary, who got deep respect for, that that's a better option than everything else we have going. In other words, out of a series of bad options, it's the least bad, because the first rule of holes is if you're in one, stop digging. Mm-hmm. Why haven't the North Koreans engaged in that conversation yet? One guess is that they want to show and demonstrate that they have a completely operable nuclear capability, deliverable to any city in the United States, and then freeze, so that they are negotiating from the best single hand they have. So the administration could well end up with this and could try to spin it as we're on the way to denuclearization. I think people would be highly skeptical.
And I think the second question was, is this being manufactured to keep saying, is the whole crisis, it's not a word I use very often on this question, is it being manufactured to strengthen the sanctions regime and up the pressure, despite the fact that some estimates say a real operational nuclear ICBM capability is not anywhere within reach, even in the next couple of years?
Could you just clarify a little bit more? Yeah.
Is it really a nuclear crisis, or is it just a way to really up the sanctions in a way that the Obama administration was not able to without the rhetoric? Is this manufactured? Is it fake news?
I don't think so. I mean, it's a real one. I mean,
we can do a lightning round.
Yeah.
Mr.
Real one.
Yeah, it's real, and I hope that nobody is dumb enough to not realize that North Korea growing economically is one of the best ways forward for all of us in the long term.
It's a real crisis, and the reason that we turn to sanctions is we can't think of many other things that give us leverage.
Yeah, I think it's a crisis. Yeah.
Great. Let me just quickly turn to the Mentimeter. This is an audience that loves engagement and diplomacy and compromise toward denuclearization. Second, I'm a little bit surprised, but we can go towards recognizing North Korea as a nuclear weapon state, but I think that's probably all recognition that war and military action are very risky and very fraught with risks that could really could start a whole regional war, is the sense I'm getting from the audience. Well, we're out of time. I know we're a minute or so past the ending mark, but thank you so much for engaging in this discussion, and we look forward to having you at more discussions like this, and please join me in thanking our panelists.